Hello everybody, welcome to the class. Dr. Ro here. Today we are going to talk about gains from trade. Gains from trade is international trade concept. Originally international trade field focusing on how trade happens, what is the main reason people trade or among the country they want to trade each other. Obviously, the reason is there is gains from trade. Sometimes it looks like there is no reason to trade each other, but actually we see through or going through about all the situation, we can find out the better way or improved or having a gains because of the trade each other. So that's today's concept and today's we are going to talk about. Well, it's been a long while to think about why the trade happens. Originally, it is coming out from the Wealth of Nation. So Adam Smith, right? It's a mother of economics, father of economics. We can call him as it. He originally brought up the idea that absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is an Adam Smith idea why trade happens. Basic idea is coming out from this logic. One country has really good producing or in the technology perspective, very efficient to produce one good. Another good has other good to produce better. For example, in history, England and France have those kind of relations. So the weather and original environment, England has absolute advantage to raise a ship. By doing so, the product out of ship, which is wool, all the clothing from the wool is way efficient to produce in England. Relatively, in France's case, France has a really nice weather to grow grapes. So they grow grapes and then make good wine. Yeah, still, France wine is very popular in the world. So in old point of view, England have absolute advantage to produce or to create the wool, and France has wine. France wine has advantage of it, absolute advantage. So in that cases, France and England can make out the big profit or gains from trade. England made a wool and export wool to the France. France, produce the wine and then export wine to England. They trade each other and they can benefit out of it. While England also can produce a small limited area to grow the grape and then produce the wine, but it is not efficient and the quality is not that good as France wine. So obviously, absolute advantage to produce wool in England, absolute advantage to produce wine in France. By doing so, they open trade and export the wool and import the French wine as the perspective of England. And France cases, export wine and import the wool from England. By doing so, they get gains from trade. That's Adam Smith's idea of why trade happen and how they can get the benefit out of it. So that is a concept of absolute advantage. But comparative advantage is later economist David Ricardo's idea. In certain cases, as time goes by, some country does have all the goods have absolute advantage of over to other country. For example, some computer productions and web production perspective, we are going to use this example. Not 100% true, but yeah, in a way we can make a sense out of it. So US have absolute advantage to produce computer and wheat. In Korea cases, doesn't have that much advanced technology to produce computer and wheat, relative to US. However, there is the way to make gains from trade between Korea and US. That's how we can, build up the idea and setups and understand ourselves, under the sense of comparative advantage, which is developed by the David Ricardo. So Adam Smith advocate that absolute advantage is the reason why trade happened, and that's the way to get or benefit out of trade of both countries involving the trade. But David Ricardo, under that, one country has an absolute advantage of two goods or all goods, but there is the way to trade each other and get a mutual benefit, between countries. That's how we are going to see today. So under the concept of comparative advantage, and find out the way to have gains from trade for the both countries. So that's comparative advantage. And how we can do it? Yeah, last time we learned about PPF, production possibility frontier. That model, using that model, we can make ourselves understood in that content. So it is a really important model and very simple model everybody can understand. But comparative advantage in the old and even now, it is really tricky concept to understand. Some people who living in the real world, especially politicians, does have comparative comment about comparative advantage, but sometimes doesn't make sense at all. Like they use wrong understanding of comparative advantage and then use it in daily life. So it's kind of complicated concept, but using the simple model like a PPF, we can, explain well and to see how we can make or how both countries can make a benefit or gains from trade under the sense of comparative advantage. So under that kind of concept, and we learned about PPF and make ourselves comfortable with using that model to, understand this concept much easier. So model itself is really powerful tool to understand a certain concept and make yourself applying that concept to, make yourself understood in, international trade concept. So comparative advantage and by using PPF. That's what we are going to do today. Are you ready? Let's get into it. Yeah, here is the two model. We're going to draw the PPF first. Our basic model of analyzing trade is two country, two goods, and a one input factor model. It is a Ricardian model in international trade field. We're going to see one by one in detail a little bit later, but first thing we are going to see is production possibility frontier we want to draw. So here's two countries, US and Korea. So let's see first in the US cases, production possibility in the US. In the US has 50,000 hours of labor available for production per month. Well, duration is not the important part, but anyway, it is given as 50,000 hours. And technology is given, like a production technology. Producing one computer requires 100 hours of labor, and production 1 ton of wheat requires 10 hours of labor. By doing so, we can see how many tons of wheat can be produced in the US and computer correspondingly. So first thing we can see is computer requires 100 hours of labor and 50,000 hours of labor is available. So suppose the US produce only computer, then how many computer can be produced? So 50,000 divided by 100, then 500 can be produced in computer. So I will mark right here 500, and computer can be produced. And producing 1 ton of wheat requires 10 hours. So 50,000 divided by 10, which is 5,000, right? 5,000 wheat can be produced. 5,000 wheat can be produced. So in this case, we are using the we can draw the PPF, and we can think of the PPF is, straight line. There is no other assumption is given. So we can draw the US PPF is like this. So it's more like not the straight line. Let me draw again. So again, straight line like this. The US PPF looks like this: 50,000 and 500 of computer and 50,000 tons of wheat can be produced. So PPF is easily understood because we learned less class. And then let's move on to the Korea cases. Production possibility in Korea: 30,000 hours of labor available, and producing 1 computer requires 124 hours, and 1 ton of wheat requires 25 hours correspondingly. Then it's the same thing, right? So how many computer only be produced in Korea? So we can get 30,000 divided by 125, which is 250. 250 computer can be produced, right? And 25, 1,500. It is given 30,000 hours of labor divided by 25, then we can get 1,500. So it is 1,500 tons of wheat can be produced in Korea given labor. So PPF of US and Korea is given like this. So it's not that difficult to figure that out, right? There is no such a assumption that a curved line of PPF. So we draw a straight line. So conversion of computer and wheat. So opportunity cost can be calculated as the slope of this PPF line. So the linear function, or line itself, does have constant slope in every single point. So we can get each one of the opportunity cost. We can interpret it as to produce 1 more computer, how many wheat should be given up, right? So those concepts can be interpreted as how the trade can be happen later. So let's think a little bit later. We analyze that, and then look at this. So I just didn't scaled correspondingly with this, but left hand side, US can produce 5,000 tons of wheat, but Korea can produce 1,500, which 1,500 tons of wheat. So in this case, we can say absolute advantage concept. The US has absolute advantage. Both goods. Why is that? So US cases, yeah, it needs 100 hours of labor is necessary to produce computer relative to the 125 in Korea. So producing computer in US is better or efficient, more efficient in US relative to Korea. And with cases, 10 hours of labor is necessary, but in Korea cases, 25 hours of labor is necessary. Direct comparison, which country has more efficient to produce both goods? In US, yeah, has more efficient in the both good cases. So US have absolute advantage of both goods in the sense of Adam Smith. Adam Smith saying absolute advantage is the reason why two countries, trade each other. But in this case, under the absolute advantage perspective, there is no way they can trade each other. But David Ricardo say comparative advantage is the key or idea of how or why trade happens. So under that sense, what is the difference we are going to understand or analyze today? So in this case, the US have absolute advantage in producing computer and wit at the same time. Everybody understand that, Next concept is like this. So before trade, they have PPF like this. And we need to assume a little bit more about this situation because there is no such a preference is given in each country. But for simplicity, we can think of this. In this case, without trade, before trade. Let's say U.S. the people or citizen in U.S. Are just enjoyed the both of goods, so they want to consume or they want to produce half of labor hours to the computer and half of labor hours to wit. How many can be produced? That is a question. Then it's easy, right? They only put in all of the labor to the computer, they can produce 500. But in this case, half and half is given to the production of computer and wit. Then, yeah, the midpoint can be one of example of production. So 250 can be produced of the computer and 2,500 of tons of wheat can be produced in the US. So this is assumption because the preference or the citizens, taste is not given. So we assume that half and half. In Korea cases, 125 midpoint and 750 tons of wheat can be produced. So this is before trade production point. So under the comparative advantage, we can find out the better way to produce the goods and services and then trade each other. By doing so, they can get gains from trade. That's what we want to prove today. In this case, before trade, they produce 125 of computer and 750 in Korea and 250 computers and 2,500 tons of wheat in US. So they produce and they consume that amount at the same time. So the point itself, both the points are on top of each country's PPF line. So efficiently production processes are going and they enjoyed a certain amount of goods, each goods like a computer and wheat. So they, before trade, on top of PPF, one of the point can be produced and can be consumed in each country. But the thing we find out gains from trade we want to find out this concept, or we want to figure that out why trade happened under the sense of comparative advantage, right? In this case, both country produce each other before trade, but in the absolute advantage concept, as I told you, in the U.S., both goods can be produced more efficiently. So 100 of hours is necessary to produce computer relative to 125 in Korea. 10 hours of labor is necessary to produce within US, relatively 25 in Korea. So both goods are more efficiently produced in the US. Why trade can be happened and how they can get the gains from trade in this case. Absolute advantage concept doesn't work, but we can figure that out under the concept of comparative advantage. So now the graph PPF is drawn before what we are using the before trade situation. One thing difference is 250 when I calculate, might miscalculate with that, right? That's this one, I mistook to 250, but this should be 240 because 30,000 divided by 125 is 240 instead of 250. So I made a mistake. I corrected. This should be 240 instead of 250. So let's think about this scenario. So I copied two graphs to the right here. And right now we have a scenario that US produce 3,400 tons of wheat, and Korea produce 240 computers. So in this case, Korea only produce computer. Korea only produce 240 computer. So 240,0, which is, only producing computer, which means Korea specialized computer, right? Computer production only in this case. And then US, let's say, produce 3,400 wheat. And how many computer they can produce? It should be on this line somewhere. And we can find out corresponding number out of it. How many? Take your time and to calculate how many computer US can produce. So to calculate it, we're looking at this graph, right? 3,400 tons of wheat times 10 hours of labor, so 34,000 of time is necessary. Remaining time is, total time is 50,000 hours, so 16,000 is left over to produce computer. And then computer needed 10 hours of labor per one computer, so divide by 100. Then 160 computers can be produced. So in this case, 160 is the computer production in the US. So in this case, Korea specialized computer and the US produced both goods at the same time, but the number itself is not half and half, 3,400 and 160 computer is produced in the US. And then one more assumption that trade can be happened, right? So how trade happens, and then they can both have gains from trade. So US export 700 tons of wheat to Korea and import 110 computer from Korea. So the US exports 700 tons of wheat, and imports 110 computer. So let's see, only 240 computer can be produced in Korea. So export 700 tons of wheat, right? Then somewhere here 700 tons, and 110 can be moved to the US. So 130 is a leftover. So 130,700 is somewhere here, I believe. And US cases, 700 tons of wheat can be exported. So 700 less, so 2,700, so somewhere here. And then 110 more of computer. So 160 to 110 is 270. So somewhere here, 270 computers can be consumed in US and Korea. So this point, let's see this point. This point can be a little bit outside of PPF line. So originally, before trade, this point can be consumed. Why? Before trade, only the point on top of PPF can be produced and they can enjoy it as, before trade situation. But wisely we produce and we trade each other a certain amount, then we can enjoy, we can consume outside of PPF. So this is one example of how both countries have mutual benefit or gains from trade can be, achieved by trade. So this one is just giving the example because once again there is no preference or consumers taste is not given in this case, but just showing that under the certain situation or under the certain scenario, gains from trade can be happen under the situation that absolute advantage is not exist, or absolute advantage in both goods is holding in one country. So one country has better technology relative to the other country, but by trade, both countries have mutual benefit or gains from trade is happening actually in this case. So this one shows the comparative advantage is like that. How this one has general idea we can have. Under this kind of cases, we draw again with the one additional graph of PPF overlapping. Let's draw this. Computer and wheat. So US PPF is 5,500 of it. So this one is US PPF. So in other cases, let me draw again. So this one, right? And then relatively 1,500 in Korea and 250, less than half of it, 240, sorry. So this one. Well, So this one shows that the US PPF shows US has a absolute advantage of both goods. They can produce more in wheat and computer at the same time. But look at the slope. Slope itself is a little bit flatter in Korea cases relative to US. US is a little bit steeper. What does that mean? Relatively, Korea have comparative advantage of producing computer. So these cases, this relative gap is really big. Wheat production itself is in Korea, it's more efficient to produce in US of the case of wheat. So comparative advantage, the slope itself or the opportunity cost of computer production in Korea is higher, rather the less opportunity cost to produce computer is in Korea less than US. So comparative advantage cases, Korea has computer. Korea has comparative advantage in computer, and the US cases comparative advantage in wheat production. So in this case, Korea is a small country. So small country is a specialized relative or comparative advantage production. So Korea produces 240 computers, and US wisely producing the mix of wheat and computer, and export and import wisely. They can both have gains from trade that they can enjoy. The reason is like this: U.S. PPF is way outside relative to Korea. If U.S. only produce wheat production is way much higher than original point of their consumption, which is before trade consumption. So computer is lacking relative to before trade cases. By doing so, to come up with or compensate computer consumption, so U.S. should produce both goods at the same time. Under the case which the difference of U.S. and Korea PPF is higher and higher, this can't generally happening. So this one is a given scenario. We can figure that out. But there is a bunch of other numbers can be calculated. But again, preference or the consumer's taste is not given. So how Korean people love to enjoy within computer consumption, or US, vice versa. So that information is not given, so we cannot give out extreme cases or specific solution out of it, but we can show under the competitive advantage situation how both countries can get benefit out of this. Today we studied the comparative advantage, and in the middle of that, I introduced absolute advantage concept. So both of them are really old concept, and as I admit, comparative advantage concept itself is really hard to understand, but using the PPF, the model, we learned it last time, and it's relatively easily we can understand it. Additional situation and additional example will be discussed during the Zoom meeting time or conference. So as a sum up, comparative advantage means that we are able to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost. Absolute advantage, one country produce more efficient production goods, and then they trade each other, by doing so getting a benefit out of it. That's usually a different shape of PPF. We will discuss in the next time. And this one giving out the example of comparative advantage and trade each other, getting gains from trade. This one, right? This one can be expanded to the individual trade too, when people or countries or provinces, cities, among them, how they trade each other. They specialize one good, and the bigger country cannot perfectly specialize it, but mixed with some production, and they trade each other. By doing so, gains from trade happens. That's what I've learned today. And by doing so, we use resources, given limited resources, wisely and efficiently, and that grows economic growth in the long run. So worldwide perspective, wisely, efficiently used resources and getting or make the world a better place. So in that perspective, comparative advantage concept is really important, and the model itself, right? PPF model itself is really important model or tools to analyze economic situation. To sum up, today the most important concept is using the PPF to understand comparative advantage. As we can see in the examples, US and Korea cases, US has absolute advantage of both product, which is wheat and computer, at the same time. So both product can produce more efficiently in US relative to Korea. But still, there was a reason why do two countries open the trade and export and import each other, and are getting mutual benefit out of that trade. So that concept, comparative advantage concept, is really important. And generally, the model itself is a simplified version of real life. If it is more than three goods, like in daily life, 100,000 of goods and services that exist, and then they trade each other. So it is a little bit complicated to apply this model directly to the real life, but it is a powerful tool to make a concept of, even though some country is very underdeveloped, but there is the reason we have opening the trade and trade each other. By doing so, we efficiently use worldwide resources, limited resources, and by doing so our economy can grow more efficiently. So understand that concept. Real life is more complicated, but simple model can give our good insight to what we should or moving forward to make our world better. So I hope you comfortably understand the comparative advantage concept, and also comfortable to deal with PPF more easily. So deeply understand more, or efficiently understand the PPF model from today, and also by doing so we can build up some complicated cases and analyze using the model to have a good intuition about real world life. So if you have any questions, let me know, and we will go over a little bit more in actual meeting or conference, coming the class time. Have a nice day. Thank you very much.